Welcome to this dialogue about European values, which I'm going to discuss with my friend, Dr. Christian Gsodam, who is the principal advisor at the European External Action Service, which is the EU's diplomatic corps, you could say. It's their external reach. And I am a senior research fellow here at Blackfriars Oxford. And we'd like to look at this question about values from two angles. One is theory, which we academics like. We teach a lot of theory about European integration, etc. But what about from the other side, practitioners like Dr. Gsodam, who is actually working within the institutions? What does any of that theory mean? Does it mean anything to them or what? So that's the kind of thing we're going to look at today. And we'd like to concentrate on two main issues. One is human dignity, the other is the rule of law. And Article 2 of the Treaty of European Union presents the EU as a union found on common values. And that's an important word, values, because one question which we will come to is there a difference between a value and a principle? The principle, philosophically, is non-negotiable. You cannot, the principle of infant child abuse is non-negotiable. It's either right or wrong. But values maybe are something different. Values are how cultures express certain principles. We're not denying the principle, but they express it in particular ways. And that's very much Europe today. I think it's a union of values, but often expressed in very different ways. And these values are not self-interpreting. They're not self-evident what they are. So the EU gives us, I put them up in a second, a list of values. And each one of those values can be discussed. Say, well, what exactly does that mean? Where does it come from? Why is this a value? Is it also a principle? And the values we're going to speak about, the two in particular, are historically layered, philosophically contested, and very often politically disputed, which is what makes Europe interesting, I think, as an entity, as a polity. And so our focus then is on human dignity and the rule of law. So the problem then that I see is that values are shared, meanings are contested. Article 2 gives you this list I mentioned: human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, and human rights. Now, they all seem self-evident. Who would not agree with these values as listed here? But the question is, what do they mean? What are they? And very often in practice, they have very divergent meanings. And many of the conflicts in the EU are disputes, not about compliance with what's written here, but about how these are interpreted in any particular context. So the question is, how are they understood in theory and applied in practice? So, Christian, do you have anything you'd like to say about this particular way of thinking about Europe?
Yeah, absolutely.
Of course, insider.
Of course, you are right, John, that the experiences of all the different member states and of the peoples of Europe are different. But all of them, without exception, have had situations where their people, their humans, have been in horrible situations, suppressed, persecuted, murdered. Take the Holocaust, take the atrocities during the Second World War in France, in Poland, in Italy, elsewhere. Take the horrible things Eastern European countries have endured during the occupation of the Soviet Empire. So I think you're right that interpretations can be different, but when it comes to human dignity, Europe from the very beginning on started to look at these things which happened these horrendous things that happened with this never again approach.
Yeah.
That is the underlying value base, which also was shared by the founding fathers of the European Union. And the, let's say, we don't call them new member states anymore, but those who joined later, they have also experiences where they would say never again.
Yeah.
And one antidote to this is the human dignity part, is that the European Union was not, as some say, created at the beginning as a club of national interests. Some describe it like that. But when you look at it, the core of the European integration process are 4 freedoms for human beings. This is the core. So the freedom to work wherever you want, the freedom to move around and to study and to live wherever you want, the freedom to sell what you have produced wherever you want, and the freedom to invest what you have earned wherever you want, for your own benefit and for the benefit of others. So we don't call them by coincidence freedoms of the citizens. Yeah, that is a very human-centered start and approach of the European Union. And out of all these freedoms, then have grown the European citizenship rights, European democracy, and so on. So I would think, yes, you are right saying that human dignity can be interpreted differently, but the important thing is for Europe that all those who join this endeavor have the understanding that their people should never again be in a situation where human dignity is compromised. And then we come to the ways how we do that.
Well, I think we will come to human dignity in a second. Just continuing the theme of European values. And one issue is, why are they European? Are they values which Europe has adopted but which are universal? And why are they not universal values? And are they EU values? And I think we need to distinguish between European values and the values of the European Union. And I think we need to remember, I think you're absolutely right that the founding of the EU was in a particular context. It was the context of the Second World War, of the horrors of the Holocaust, of the threat of the Soviet Union, another threat to human dignity. And it was a moral response to that. And I think that's very important. The founding fathers of the EU were almost all Catholics, not all of them, but mostly Catholics. And Robert Schuman has actually been proposed for canonization as a cause up. And they had a moral vision of Europe. And I think it's very important. And a moral vision is a vision that's based on moral values, and human dignity is one of them. So I think we need to put that context in. And then the other, just to clarify things, because they're often confused, is that we have European values, which are covering all of Europe, and we have the values of the EU itself, which is a particular kind of entity. So Europe is wider than the EU, and the Council of Europe is another body, similar name, but it has, I think today it's 46 member states. You said 47, including Russia. Russia is no longer a member. I think Belarus has been excluded as well. But there are 46 member states, and their function then is to promote human rights and democracy. That's their primary purpose, and it's there that the European Court of Human Rights is situated in Strasbourg. So that, and Winston Churchill actually was also somewhat behind setting up that body of the Council of Europe. Now the EU is different. It is founded for a different purpose, but it's closely related. So this was a way, I would say, of creating a political system that would put into practice for the nation states who are members those principles that the Council of Europe and the European Court of Human Rights were formulating. So they're closely linked. In fact, the EU has actually incorporated the Convention of Rights that the EU, the Council of Europe had actually drawn up. And so the EU inherited many of the norms, but developed them within a different legal and political structure. Now, it's something we can talk about again. The EU, so what is the EU then? Let's think about it for a second. So mostly international organizations have been bodies like the UN, like World Trade Organization, like GATT, etc. But the EU is not like that. It's not like an international treaty organization. It's actually something more like a federation, but it's not quite a federation either. So it's what I would call a hybrid polity, which has state-like features, federal-like features. It is a system of governance. It has a system of law, which makes it different from many of those other bodies. And that law is binding on its own members, which doesn't happen with the United Nations, for example. But it's still not quite federation. And we could maybe discuss that in a second as well. So this gives EU values a very direct role in law, policy, and enforcement. And so we have a number of articles in the Constitutional Treaty. Article 2 is one of them, but there are some more as well. So, see if I can put up here. So these are the other articles, which are all designed to protect human dignity and human rights. They've actually been used quite a lot in the past number of years with conflict with particularly Poland, Hungary, Romania, some of the, and the Commission, etc. So this is something quite different from these other organizations. So I think we should be quite proud of this institution called the EU, because it's actually creating something new. I would call it an innovative form of governance that is not a nation state, it's not a federation, more like the Holy Roman Empire, I would say, than any of them. So what do you
Yes, you are completely right when you say that those institutions are all related. Even more, the European Union, for example, requires that every state which wants to become member of the European Union is first member of the Council of Europe.
Yeah.
Why? Because only a state which has fully embraced the values and the principles enshrined in the charter, the charters of the Council of Europe, will be ready to do the political job which is necessary. Yeah, when you enter the community.
Yeah.
So first, that means the cooperation is very close. The monitoring the Council of Europe is doing on democracy, on rule of law, all of that. That is a basis on which the European Union builds on then with other tools, which are, you're right, more political, which are linked to money, which are linked to power then, because the Council of Europe is more, let's say, an international organization which is there to monitor, to agree principles, to monitor, but let's say the implementation, we have to say, somehow is quite weak.
Yeah.
Because they don't have the means. Yeah. And the European Union has the means to go after infringements of treaties and so on. That one first point. You also said we can be proud of the European Union because it is more than an international organization. Indeed. And I would underline one thing. The European Union is today a democracy. Yeah. This is a massive difference between international organizations like the UN or the Council of Europe or the WTO, which are government-ruled organizations, where you have diplomats sitting there negotiating, and it's important that we have that. The European Union has evolved from such an organization where also diplomats from member states were sitting together and decided what should be done, into a real democracy. Because today, all organs of the European Union have a democratic route, starting with the European Parliament and the direct elections, yeah. But then, which has then tremendous powers, not only as a legislator, but also the power to elect the president of the European Commission, to revoke every single commissioner or the whole commission, to block things like we have seen with the Mercosur now, where the European Parliament says, well, we want to have it checked by the Court of Justice, so it's on hold, So very strong democratic from a direct route, but then what I also would like to bring a little bit more to the surface, the second chamber, the Council of Ministers, where we think very often, but this is just the diplomatic game. No, it is basically, when you look at it, you said we have a sort of federal structure. It is a little bit like a Senate.
Yeah.
It represents at European level the member states, like the Senate in the US represents the 50 states. The election of those members is different. It's not directly, it's an indirect election by the parliaments or by the people, depends. The Chancellor of Germany is elected by indirectly also by the parliament. So it's a second chamber, but it has democratic roots. I leave it there, but what I wanted to say is Europe has become more than just an institution. It is a democracy.
Yes, I think it's so sad that we've left Brexit. I think we benefited so much being part of the EU. We are still part of Europe, but we were also part of the EU. So let's move on then, finally, to human dignity. And I would say human dignity is the foundational value of all the values we looked at. And it's arguably the most fundamental of all these values. So it underlines human rights discourse. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights placed dignity as its center, but left it undefined. It's very, very important. And this gave the concept great reach, but also opened it to rival interpretations. And this ambiguity still remains. I'll speak about that in a moment, but just why was that? Well, when we think back to the 1940s, after the Second World War, a committee was set up by UNESCO, actually, to formulate a declaration of human rights. And they brought together people from various kind of traditions. We had René Cassin, who is a French Jew, who was a secularist. We had a Confucian scholar from China. We had a Melkite Orthodox person. We had Social Democrats. And we had Jacques Maritain, who was not a member of the committee, but he was actually involved in it. And Maritain later wrote a very good article, a very interesting article about this committee. And he said they all agreed we must have human dignity in as the foundation, as the very first of all of the articles of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. But we don't know really what it means. No one could agree exactly what it meant. So it became what Christopher McCrudden, a great legal scholar, has called a placeholder concept. So it was put in as the foundation, and then almost that, Christopher McCrudden has written very extensively on this, and a number of constitutions, lists of human rights, etc., that have human dignity as the foundation, really stemming from this, but not really defining what it is. Okay. Now, this is something I'd like to just put to you as a practitioner, if you think it is useful. I have just finished a book, as you know, called Human Dignity. And Father Richard asked me to organize a series of lectures here with various speakers from different Christian traditions about what it meant. And I read Christian Gsodam's book, a massive British Academy handbook with many pages. And at the end, I realized I was quite shocked at how differently people understood this concept. And today we use the same word to justify or support totally different positions. We use it in favor of abortion, against abortion, for same-sex marriage, against same-sex marriage, etc., etc. So the meaning is not very clear sometimes. And what I did in my book was I tried to make as clearly as I could what the Catholic Church's teaching is on human dignity, according to the magisterium. I didn't make this up, I took the magisterium documents and where it came from. So I said what it is, and then I looked back, why does the church hold these positions? And they're not purely arbitrary, irrational, reactionary for the sake of it, but have a history, a genealogy of the concept. And I think in all of these values that we're looking at, we could do a similar thing. We could look at democracy, we could look at rights, we could look at laws. Anyway, this is what I come up with here. So let's see what you think of this. So these are the main positions, I think, main ways of understanding it today in Western countries. So we have the classical and Christian traditions which link dignity to reason, moral agency, ultimately the image of God, that we have an absolute dignity because we're made in the image and likeness of God. So we have an ontological dignity that cannot be taken away. And I think that's very important. Then we have Renaissance humanism, which deepened this sense of human potential and vocation. Then we had the Reformation, which had a rather different understanding of image and likeness that Catholicism had. And that sort of one of the unintended consequences of the Reformation was to lead to the Enlightenment, actually. Individualism, Enlightenment, reason. And Immanuel Kant then came along and he tried to justify human dignity without any appeal to revelation. The previous position was Genesis 1:26-27, made me into God. He said, well, not everyone will accept that. As seculars say, well, so what? We don't believe in God, don't like God. So he tried to get a formulation of human dignity, didn't rely on scripture. And what he came up with was the notion of dignity means rational autonomy and self-legislation. It's the kind of Kantian idea. And this idea has become very widespread in Western societies. But people like John Loughlin, Habermas use this kind of understanding of dignity. And now I would actually question this from a Catholic point of view, because I think Catholic social teaching retained a thicker view. This is a very thin procedural type of dignity, and it's quite fragile. So if someone loses their autonomy, gets sick or ill, can't dress themselves, in this perspective, they've lost their dignity. And that justifies euthanasia or whatever. Now, Catholic social teaching views dignity as quite different. It accepts autonomy. I mean, autonomy is part of dignity. We have to be able to function as human beings by ourselves, but it's also relational. So if you lose certain aspects of your autonomy, you rely on others. We have this relational dimension. We're not simply individuals, but we're human persons. It's quite different. This personalism is very important. And dignity is also ordered to the common good. So it's not simply me as an individual lose my autonomy. I'm a person in a community, and it's linked to the common good. Now, contemporary Europe lives with these overlapping but not fully compatible traditions. So does that have any resonance with, or do you think it's just pie in the sky?
No, not at all. What becomes clear is nobody really owns the final definition what human dignity is. I would add here you could add many more, but I would, for example, add here the whole scientific discovery which was made in the 19th, in the 20th century on the psychological side of the human being, which enlightened us also a little bit on dignity and why things are like they are. The problem, I think, comes from the fact that we sometimes tend to make certain definitions absolute. These are the absolute definitions, how it should look like. As I said, I don't think that anybody owns it. We have to look at it from a multi-dimensional way. You said the rational part. There is the more religious part in it, which is the relational part in a transcendent way. But then there is also the part of your psychology, the part of your relations with other human beings. So I think when we try to define human dignity, we have to look at all those dimensions to come to suggestions how we could honor it best. And then I think that the most important thing is, apart from the definitions, when you act politically, and that is important for the European Union, you have to first decide, do we act for a system or do we put the human being at the center of our reflections? If you put a system like we want to have communism, or we want to have capitalism, or we want to have this and that, the question of human dignity will be of minor importance. It will be just here and there. Or you opt for a human-centered approach, and then the question of what is really a situation of dignity for a human being has to be answered in every political decision. And then, when you are in a democratic setting, you will not escape that you will have the discussion on what it concretely means for the different questions, as you mentioned, abortion, or marriage, or euthanasia, or other questions, or less ethic-bound questions are also linked with human dignity. For example, less personal questions like equal pay for men and women. Yeah, it's a human dignity question. Yeah, or the question of having fresh water. Yeah, and a good environment is also part of human dignity, to live a life which is worth of being lived. So all these discussions then have to integrate an approach on dignity, and that's not easy. And nobody will have the formula, which is then put always at the beginning of each law. This is the human dignity, and from there we start. I think it's a discussion. Yeah, I think it's a journey.
I think it's interesting that I would say we need to enter into dialogue.
Yeah.
From different perspectives, because we have very fundamentally different views of what human life is about, and what a human being is. Are we this rich person open to transcendence, or are we the naked ape? There's a famous book, Dead and Mortal, we're just naked, just apes. The whole neuroscience approach, we're nothing but, our brain is nothing but a specific computer, or is there something else? I mean, how do we explain things like love, poetry, music, etc.? So behind all of these issues is that fundamental question is, what does it mean to be a human being?
Indeed.
What is our anthropology? And what I'm trying to promote here is a kind of theological anthropology from the point of view of Catholic social teaching. But I know there are other models out there that would not accept that because they don't have the basic beliefs that I would have as a Catholic. So for me, the question of going forward in this is, how do we inaugurate a dialogue across these different positions, very fundamental philosophical and anthropological understandings, in order to perhaps come to some kind of way of living together and respecting each other and helping each other, learning from each other in some way. Yeah.
One example, when the Germans after the Second World War were asked to write their constitution,
Yeah.
The group of people who should do that was confined on an island on a lake in Germany, and they were told, you discuss now this until you are ready. And they have very tough discussions on values, on principles and everything. And they also were under certain time pressure. They have to deliver something which should be the Grundgesetz, the basic law of this future Germany. And so they were discussing all these things and all these things. And then they came with that proposal, as you know. The first sentence of the Grundgesetz, of the basic law of Germany, reads, Die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar. I try to translate it because it's unantastbar would be untouchable, but that's not it. It's inalienable. Yeah, I would translate it. Human dignity is sacred.
Okay.
Yeah. So and when they did that, they knew we have not fully discussed all of this.
Yeah.
We will have to roll it out. And this is, I think, what constitutions in general do. They put things in there which need later interpretation.
Yeah.
And this is why, for example, the European Union has these principles. But then it took a long time. But then we have now the Charter of the Fundamental Rights, where many rights, many values have been spelled out after a thorough discussion, again, a convention, again, a group of people sitting together discussing this and parliaments ratifying it. But I think what I want to say with this is these values and principles call us exactly to what you say, John, to this human dialogue, which is necessary to spell out what they mean for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, also, I think to come to a realization, we mean different things. We're using the same terminology, but speaking past each other. And I think a true dialogue consists of laying all of your cards on the table, saying this is where I stand or where we stand, and then saying, well, okay, inviting others to do the same, having this kind of discussion, and then trying to move beyond it, find what we have in common, etc. Okay, let's move on. So these are just some of the ways in which we can have these different ways of conflicts and different understandings as well. So, rule of law. Let's move on to our next major value, the rule of law. Everyone probably thinks, well, we all know what rule of law means. It's obvious, isn't it? Rule of law. But it's not that obvious because the term itself actually comes from English. It's an English word, an English phrase, rule of law. And it means a certain thing in English legal history. You know, it's the notion of common law, of law from a bottom up kind of law. And also in this Anglo tradition, we don't have a state. We have a crown. We have America maybe has the Constitution, but there's no state. And as a moral person, as a French legal philosopher might say. And so the German concept then is Rechtsstaat, so the law of the state. Because in Germany you do have a moral entity called the state, which we don't have. And the same in French, l'état de droit. That could be with a capital E, état de droit. That could be with a small e, état de droit, which means something rather different as well. So these three kind of, I give some of the overlapping, some of the main ideas there. But Europe these are the three dominant traditions in Europe, basically, and so here we have them here again. So they all affirm legal restraint, but not exactly the same conceptual language. So the EU therefore works with a common principle refracted through different constitutional cultures. Okay, okay. So anyway, I'll hand over to you, Christian, because you are a legal scholar as well, a political scientist. So as a practitioner, one question that strikes me that I think is interesting is the EU itself developing its own distinctive tradition that is somehow maybe above these three traditions, but maybe drawing on some of them more than others to something that distinctively EU. The European Court of Justice, for example, would be the body which
I would start a little bit earlier because all what we understand in law has somehow to do with what the Romans have done. Roman law is the basis for how we developed legal thinking in Europe and beyond. And what was important for the Romans was to develop procedures which would make it easier to organize interests, different interests, also to help to manage the rapport de force. So, for example, those who were accused with the accusers, the defendant, and so on. So it was very procedural. And I think this is important when we think about rule of law. You need always to channel things, procedures, which makes it objective, how you do it. It makes it transparent, what is happening. You can reproduce it, you can learn from it, and so on. And this is what reglementation, what law does. And constitutions have also this role. Hans Kelsen, big positivist, who wrote the Austrian Constitution, said, Constitution is just another word for the rule of the game which we give each other. So it's about procedures. The Magna Carta was, if you take all away the mystery and all of it, it was a procedure of how the king would have to deal with the other important. The Goldene Bulle in Germany was a procedure how the emperor would have to deal with the princes and so on. Now, all these different traditions are there, but the European Union has been created also, and Jean Monnet said it once, he said it, we create more than what else, what we create is we create a method. We create a way how to do it. We create a procedure which then will help us to go forward progressively. And you're right, we are coming from all these different angles. Maybe that was not completely understood correctly at the beginning what rule of law is. But again, we built on what the Council of Europe has done. The jurisprudence, which was there. The Venice Commission, which they are continuously doing still the job. And then I come to the very recent development. In 2020, the European Union has decided to issue every year a rule of law report. What is that? The European Commission works together with the member states, but not only with member states, with the judiciaries of all member states, with civil society of all member states. They look at every member state and go to the member state and have discussions on a standard form which has been, or which had been agreed by all the member states, which are the procedures, the principles we are looking at. There are 4 pillars where they do this. First, how is the judiciary working? Second, what is done in the field of the fight against corruption? Third, what is the civil society, the media, freedom of media and freedom of speech, so the whole civil society part. And the fourth is the institutional part, is the check and balances, the parliament and all of that working well. So that's the basic structure, but they can add other things. So what they do, they collect information from everybody in Spain. There's a network also for each member state where the information comes in. Then they look at this, they draw up a report with concrete recommendations every year, what Bulgaria, Austria, or Luxembourg has to do. I give you an example that can be very concrete. For example, what has the state done in order to avoid the revolving doors between cabinet members of ministers and high administrative positions, which is in the second pillar, which could be a case of corruption. Yeah. So they look at it and they say not enough has been done in the state A or B to fight these revolving doors, for example. And then there is a whole procedure how they go about it with the council. The council is also looking at it. The parliament is also looking at it. And if it is really, but we will come to it, if it is really a heavy mistake or infringement of rule of law, then the treaty foresees Article 7, and it also, the European Union has also the possibility via the conditionalities, so the budget policies to European semester to say, you will not get this money, you refer to it, Hungary, Poland, if you do not really improve this situation. So yes, the understanding wasn't always the same, but with time we have established in the European Union a real procedure and method how to look at it together, and to do it in a cycle annually, so that we lose not track of the things which need to be done.
Okay, good. I should just add to your historical survey, go back to the Romans. I think we could come a little bit later to about the 11th century when Pope Gregory VII began to standardize canon law.
Yes.
And as this period, and canon law, very good book by Harold Berman, who wrote a Revolution in Law was the name of this book, and he talked about the papal revolution, and he said the Catholic Church became a kind of nation state with this common system of law, because it is varying traditions, and even Roman law was very fragmentary, and Germanic law coming in from the barbarians. So this standardized law and set up universities like Bologna is a great example of teaching canon lawyers, and these priests then, in fact, with their countries and implement this. So it's a sort of process, this kind of more modernization of the Roman law experience, I think. So next question for me is, who interprets the values? Because I think of many of these conventions of human rights, who has the power to interpret the meaning of a word will determine how that is implemented in law. It's in this case. We have the Supreme Court, the UK, which defined sex in the Human Rights Act, the Equality Act 2010, meaning biological sex. So that was interpreted by that had been interpreted in very many different ways previously to that by various groups, So anyway, in the European case, what would you say about this?
Well, in a democracy, and I mean, this is the frame in which we are operating, you have to the first role of interpreting values and principles is the legislator. It's the legislator. And the legislator is put in place by the people according to their, let's say, choice. If the people vote more for people who are in the Catholic value tradition, the legislator will go more in that direction. If they don't, it will go more in the other direction. So the legislator has the first key to all this interpretation. The second key, obviously, then is with the judiciary and with the courts. But the courts always have to respect the law. If the courts decide something, the legislator tomorrow can change that and can put it the other way around. But yes, the judiciary interprets also in the European Union. The European Court of Justice has a huge power in interpreting values and deciding on concrete cases in which way it should go. And then finally, there is the third branch, which is the executive branch, which also has a power in not only suggesting laws, but in financing. It's a very important part of how you bring laws or values to life. You can decide that you finance certain things, or you don't finance them, or other things, and that there is the saying that budget is politics in figures. Yeah, and I think that is something which is very important, and we see it with the sanctions, for example, in the European Union. If certain member states do not follow certain rules, the Commission can hold back money.
Good. Okay. Well, I think it brings me to my kind of last general comment. And we'll just conclude after that. So really strikes me about the EU. It is, how would we describe it? Well, I would see it as a democratic and multi-level system. I think this is what you've been very much bringing out in your comments. It's a hybrid political system, but not a nation state, though some features of the nation state. It is a liberal representative democracy. Liberal representative democracy actually developed in the context of the modern nation state, but the EU didn't. So democracy in the EU will have a different kind of meaning than it would have in a nation state. So there's a particularly European type of democracy, is what the Council on the Future of Europe recently, they tried to answer that question: what kind of democracy is European? And we were actually writing a report for that from the Committee of the Regions. So the EU therefore raises a structural question: can democracy function in the same way at a supranational level? And this is complicated by this multi-level governance aspect of the EU, which complicates accountability, participation, representation. You know, the Committee of the Regions, where we first started working 30 years ago together, is the poor cousin, as it were. It has struggled to make itself present in the EU institutions. I think it's gone very far from when we first started, but nevertheless, still quite a poor cousin. And this will affect how values such as dignity and rule of law are perceived and implemented in practice. So just fairly briefly, what do you think of this idea of the European democracy as such?
It's evolving. It's evolving. We are not yet there, but we have made tremendous progress. I give you some comparisons, because comparing, you sometimes realize how far we have come. when the European Union concluded the famous CETA agreement with Canada, the free trade agreement with Canada, one of the big problems was that there was no common market in Canada. So a Canadian enterprise from British Columbia that wanted to invest in Nova Scotia couldn't just do it tomorrow. They had to go through all kinds of procedures in order to be able to do it. We Europeans, we have that. We have that. Every Finnish can just go to Poland or to Portugal and open a shop and just sell things. We said to the Canadians, but look, this is not enough deeply integrated for us. If you want to do business with us, you have to integrate yourself more. What do I want to say with that? We call Canada a state, and rightly so. But in that feature, the state of Canada is less integrated than the European Union, or was. Yeah. So the Union was more unified and more, let's say, state-like than Canada. One example. Other example. Because we always say, oh, Europe cannot be a state because of all those languages, all those traditions, all those histories and everything which the different nations which are there, you cannot bring them together. My question then always is, look at India. Look at India. India has more languages than Europe has. It has more peoples
300, I think,
than Europe has. It has more histories than Europe has. When you take the north, which is very much Muslim, the northeast, and you take the south, which is very Hindu, and then you have the Buddhism, and then you have the Christian, and everything is in it. And still, it is a state. It is a state with even, let's say, such a diversity which we not even have in Europe. So also there you start to think, okay, they can be a state, we cannot be a state. Why would that be? So there are many things, I think, where we have not really still found our way out of the lack of conviction that we could actually make it, that it could be possible. We are still a little bit entangled in our past, in all those conflicts and what happened to us, that it is unimaginable that could happen. But we are on the way, and I think we just should continue also with activities like these, like this one, explaining what Europe really is and why it is so important, so that people finally will support it and say yes. And last word, because we are here in the UK, very often, and that's a very human thing, you know what you have or had only when you lose it. This is like that in your personal relationships, very often the case, because you have it, you criticize it and everything, but then it is gone, you realize it was not so bad. And I think this is something we have to work on, that people understand it's not all bad, it's not all to be criticized, it is something we have to work on, but it is basically a good thing.
Okay, well, I'd like to just wrap up a little, come to an end, and so just a few conclusions. Well, I think European values are real, but they're neither simple nor self-executing. We have to realize them ourselves as human beings. We must put them into practice and realize them. Human dignity raises the anthropological question: what view of the human person underlies European public life? The rule of law raises the constitutional question: how are these values embodied, limited, enforced? And the challenge for the EU, as I see it, is to uphold these common values while recognizing the diversity of the traditions through which they're understood. And I would also add to that, go back to that vision of Schumann, that Adenauer and de Gasperi. It's a moral vision of Europe, not just a technocratic one or an economic one of the human person. And I think theory and practice can be held together only if Europe remains conscious of the historical and philosophical sources of its own values. And on that, I'd like to thank Christian for your brilliant remarks on all of these questions. And I think we've had a true insider's view that really is very good for we academics, because we have a rather distant understanding of what's going on, but you're right in the middle of it. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.